I gotta hit the record button. I almost forgot.
말없이 소중한 정도 너와 나 모두의 행복도 미치는 배우고 때 빛이 나옵니다. 배우자 내 나라를 위해 배우자 난 나를 위해 우리의 시구나 너무 부딪혀
Welcome in, and of course, we are continuing on our usual Thursday read, which is right now, as many of you might know, the collected works of Comrade Stalin, Volume 1. And we are a few works into this by now. Specifically on this title right here, briefly about disagreements in the party. And before we even begin to read this here, we have a footnote here from the original author, editor. J.V. Stalin's pamphlet, briefly about disagreements in the party, was written at the end of April 1905. In reply to articles by N. Jordania, Majority or Minority, in the Social Democrat, What is a Party? In Mogazari, and others. News of the appearance of this pamphlet soon reached the Bolshevik center abroad. On July 18, 1905, N.K. Krupskaya wrote to the Caucasian Union Committee of the RSDLP, requesting that copies of the pamphlet be sent to the center. The pamphlet was widely circulated among the Bolshevik organizations in Transcaucasia. From it, the advanced workers learned of the disagreements within the party of the stand taken by the Bolsheviks headed by V.I. Lenin. The pamphlet was printed at the underground printed press, the Caucasian Union of the RSDLP, in Avlabar in May 1905, in the Georgian language, and in June it was printed in the Russian and Armenian languages, each in 1,500 2,000 copies. Yeah, written in 1905, April 1905. Briefly about the disagreements in the party. And he quotes Karl Kautsky here. Like I say, reading these collective works is going to be very interesting as you see what develops throughout the course of all of this. Social democracy is a combination of the working class movement with socialism. Karl Kautsky. Our Mensheviks are really too tiresome. I'm referring to the Tiflis Mensheviks. They heard that there are disagreements in the party, and so they began harping. Whether you like it or not, we shall talk about disagreements. Always and everywhere. Whether you like it or not, we shall abuse the Bolsheviks right and left. And so they are hurling abuse for all they are worth, as if they are possessed. At all the crossroads, among themselves and among strangers, in short, wherever they may happen to be, they howl one thing: beware of the majority. They are strangers, infidels. Not content with the habitual field, they have carried the case into the legally published literature, thereby proving to the world once again how tiresome they are. What has the majority done? Why is our minority so wrathful? Let us turn to history. The majority, quote unquote, and minority first came into being at the Second Party Congress 1903. That was the Congress at which our scattered forces were to have united in one powerful party. We party workers placed great hopes in that Congress. At last, we exclaimed joyfully, we too shall be united in one party. We too shall be able to work according to a single plan. It goes without saying that we had been active before that. But our activities were scattered and unorganized. It goes without saying that we had been active before that, but our activities were scattered and unorganized. It goes without saying that we had made attempts to unite before that. It was for this purpose that we convened the First Party Congress, 1898. And it even looked as if we had united. But this unity existed in name only. The party still remained split up into separate groups. Our forces still remained scattered and had yet to be united. And so, the Second Party Congress was to have mustered our scattered forces and united them in one whole. We were to have formed a united party. Actually, it turned out, however, that her hopes had been to some degree premature. The Congress failed to give us a single and indivisible party. It merely laid the foundation for such a party. The Congress did, however, clearly reveal to us that there are two trends within the party. The Iskra trend, I mean the old Iskra, and here we have a note from the original editor again. Iskra, the Spark, the first all-Russian illegal Marxist newspaper, founded by V.I. Lenin in 1900. The first issue of Lenin's Iskra appeared on December 11th, 24th, 1900, in Leipzig, after which it was published in Munich, London from April 1902, and beginning with the spring of 1903 in Geneva. Groups and committees of the RSDLP supporting the Lenin-Iskra line were organized in a number of towns of Russia, including St. Petersburg and Moscow. In Transcaucasia, the ideas propagated by Iskra were upheld by the illegal newspaper Britzola, the organ of Georgian Revolutionary Social Democracy. On the role and significance of Iskra, see the history of the CPSU, short course, Moscow, 1952, pages 55 to 68. So, the Congress did, however, clearly reveal to us that there are two trends within the party. The Iskra trend, I mean the old Iskra, and the trend of its opponents. Accordingly, the Congress split up into two sections, into a majority and a minority. The former joined the Iskra trend and rallied around that paper. The latter, being opponents of Iskra, took the opposite stand. Thus became the banner of the party majority, and Iskra stand became the stand of the majority. What path did Iskra take? What did it advocate? To understand this, one must know the conditions under which it entered the historical field. Iskra started publication in December 1900. That was the time when a crisis began in Russian industry. The industrial boom, which was accompanied by a number of economic strikes, 1896 to 98, gradually gave way to a crisis. The crisis grew more acute day by day and became an obstacle to economic strikes. In spite of that, the working class movement hewed a path for itself and made progress. The individual streams merged in a single flood. The movement acquired a class aspect and gradually took the path of the political struggle. The working class movement grew with astonishing rapidity, but there was no sign of an advanced detachment, no social democracy. And here we have another note. Social democracy is an advanced detachment of the proletariat. Every militant social democrat, whether industrial worker or intellectual, belongs to this detachment. But there was no sign of an advanced detachment, no social democracy, which would have introduced socialist consciousness into the movement, would have combined it with socialism, and thereby would have lent the proletarian struggle a social democratic character. And now something, of course, when we're talking through about this as well, not only do not get too caught up on the word social democrat in this, because there's going to be a serious split, as we all know, with social democracy and communism, Bolsheviks. But not only that, you have to understand that what we're learning is the lessons and the underlying revolutionary core, not the words themselves, because strategies and names and things change over time. And the social democracy that Stalin is talking about here has nothing to do with the social democracy that, like, the NDP or the DSA is talking about, right? That it's a whole different thing, which is why he's even specifying here in the notes, number 3, social democracy is the advanced detachment of the proletariat. Every militant social democrat, whether industrial worker or intellectual, belongs to this detachment. Well, today we call that just communist, right? Marxist-Leninist. That term, Marxist-Leninist, did not exist yet, and would not exist for a very long time. So just a little Larry note there for you. What did the social democrats of that time, they were called economists, do? They burned incense to the spontaneous movement and lightheartedly reiterated, socialist consciousness is not so very necessary for the working class movement, which can be very well reach its goal without it. The main thing is the movement. The movement is everything. Consciousness is a mere trifle. A movement without socialism. That was what they were striving for. In that case, what is the mission of Russian social democracy? Its mission is to be an obedient tool of the spontaneous movement, they asserted. It is not our business to introduce socialist consciousness into the working class movement. It is not our business to lead this movement. That would be fruitless coercion. Our duty is merely to watch the movement and take careful note of what goes on in social life. We must drag at the tail of the spontaneous movement. Got a footnote number 4 here. Our social democrat. It looks like the footnote has a footnote. The footnote has a footnote. Our social democrat. The illegal newspaper published in the Georgian language in Tiflis by the Caucasian Mensheviks from April to November 1905. It was edited by N. Jordania. The first number appeared as the organ of the Tiflis Committee of the RSDLP. but in the subsequent issues it called itself the Organ of the Caucasian Social Democratic Labor Organizations. So that's what that Social Democrat is. That's the paper. So our Social Democrat, that paper we just defined, has developed a passion for criticism, quote unquote. See number 1, majority or minority. But I must observe that it does not correctly describe the economists and Rabachai Deloists. They scarcely differ from each other. It is not that they ignored political questions, but that they dragged at the tail of the movement and repeated what the movement suggested to them. At one time, only strikes took place, and so they preached the economic struggle. The period of demonstrations came, 1901. Blood was shed, disillusionment was rife, and the workers turned on terrorism in the belief that that would save them from the tyrants. And so the economist Rabachai Delois also joined the general chorus and pompously declared, "The time has come to resort to terrorism, to attack the prisons, liberate our comrades," and so forth. See A Historic Turn, Rabachai Dello, and Rabachai Dello, The Workers' Cause, a magazine published in Geneva at irregular intervals from 1899 to 1902 by the Union of the Russian Social Democrats Abroad, economists, as they were referred to, we said earlier. So see A Historic Turn, Rabachai Dello. As you see, this does not at all mean that they ignored political questions. The author has borrowed his criticism from Montanarv, but it would have been more useful had he familiarized himself with history. That was one hell of a note there at the end. In short, social democracy was depicted as an unnecessary burden on the movement. Whoever refuses to recognize social democracy must also refuse to recognize the Social Democratic Party. That is precisely why the economists so persistently reiterated that a proletarian political party could not exist in Russia. Let the liberals engage in the political struggle. It is more fitting for them to do so, said the economists. But what must we Social Democrats do? We must continue to exist as separate circles, each operating isolatedly in its own corner. Not a party, but a circle, they said. Thus, on the one hand, the working class movement grew and stood in need of a guiding advanced detachment. On the other hand, social democracy, represented by the economists, instead of taking the lead of the movement, abnegated itself and dragged at the tail of the movement. It was necessary to proclaim for all to hear the idea that a spontaneous working class movement without socialism means groping in the dark. And even if it ever does take lead to the goal, who knows how long it will take, and at what cost in suffering. That consequently, socialist consciousness is of enormous importance for the working class movement. It was also necessary to proclaim that it is the duty of the vehicle of this consciousness, social democracy, to imbue the working class movement with socialist consciousness, to be always at the head of the movement, and not be a mere observer of the spontaneous working class movement, not to drag at its tail. It was also necessary to express the idea that it is the direct duty of Russian social democracy to muster the separate advanced detachments of the proletariat, to unite them in one party, and thereby to put an end to disunity in the party once and for all. It was precisely these tasks that Iskra proceeded to formulate. This is what it was said This is what it said in its programmatic article. See Iskra number 1. Quote, social democracy is a combination of the working class movement with socialism. And of course, original editor see V.I. Lenin work, 4th Russian edition, volume 4. So I'll start this quote over again. This is what it said in the programmatic article, see Iskra number 1. Quote, social democracy is a combination of the working class movement with socialism, i.e., the movement without socialism, or socialism standing aloof from the movement, is an undesirable state of affairs, which social democracy must combat. But as the economist Rabochai Delowis worshipped the spontaneous movement, and as they belittled the importance of socialism, Iskra stated, quote, isolated from social democracy, the working class movement becomes petty and inevitably becomes bourgeois, unquote. Consequently, it is the duty of social democracy, quote, to point out to this political movement its ultimate aim and its political tasks, and to guide its political and ideological independence, unquote. What are the duties of the Russian social democracy? From this, continues Iskra, automatically emerges the task which it is the mission of Russian social democracy to fulfill: to imbue the masses of the proletariat with the ideas of socialism and with political consciousness, and to organize a revolutionary party that will be inseverably connected with the spontaneous working class movement, i.e., it must always be at the head of the movement, and its paramount duty is to unite the social democratic forces of the working class movement in one party. That is how the editorial board of Iskra formulated its program. The editorial board of Iskra then consisted of 6 members: Plekhanov, Axelrod, Zachulich, Martov, Starover, and Lenin. And Starover is the pseudonym of A.N. Pochertsov. Did Iskra carry out this splendid program? Everybody knows how devotedly it put these extremely important ideas into practice. That was clearly demonstrated to us by the Second Party Congress, at which the majority, numbering 35 votes, recognized Iskra as the central organ of the party. Is it not ridiculous, after that, to hear certain pseudo-Marxists berate the old Iskra? This is what the Menshevik Social Democrat writes about Iskra. Quote, Iskra should have analyzed the ideas of economism, rejected its fallacious views and accepted its correct ones, and directed it into a new channel. But that did not happen. The fight against economism gave rise to another extreme. The economic struggle was belittled and treated with disdain. Supreme importance was attached to the political struggle. Politics without economy, it ought to be without economics. Such is a new trend. See Social Democrat, number 1, majority or minority. But when, where, in what country did all this happen? Highly esteemed critic. What did Plekhanov, Axelrod, Zasulich, Martov, and Starover do? Why did they not turn Iskra to the true quote-unquote path? Did they not constitute the majority on the editorial board? And where have you yourself been up to now, my dear sir? Why did you not warn the Second Party Congress? it would not then have recognized Iskra as the central organ. But let us leave the critic, quote unquote. The point is that Iskra correctly emphasized the urgent questions of the day. It took the path I spoke about above and devotedly carried out its program. Iskra's stand was still more distinctly and convincingly formulated by Lenin. In his splendid book, What Is to Be Done? Let us deal with this book. The economists worship the spontaneous working class movement. But who does not know that the spontaneous movement is a movement without socialism? That it is trade unionism. Lenin, What Is to Be Done, page 18. That it is trade unionism which refuses to see anything beyond the limits of capitalism. Who does not know that the working class movement without socialism means marking time within the limits of capitalism, wandering around private property, and even if this ever does take lead to the social revolution, who knows how long it will take, and at what cost and suffering? Does it make no difference to the workers whether they enter the promised land in the near future or after a long period of time? By an easy or by a difficult road? Clearly, whoever extols the spontaneous movement and worships it, whether he wishes to or not, digs a chasm between socialism and the working class movement, belittles the importance of socialist ideology, and expels it from life, and whether he wishes to or not, subordinates the workers to bourgeois ideology. For he fails to understand that social democracy is a combination of the working class movement with socialism. We've got number 8 here. That's from Kotsky, the Erfaret Program, published by the Central Committee, page 94. Oh, what interesting days we are in. For he fails to understand that, quote, social democracy is a combination of working class movement with socialism. And all worship of the spontaneity of the working class movement, all belittling of the role of the conscious element, of the role of social democracy, means quite irrespective of whether he belittler wants to or not, strengthening the influence of bourgeois ideology over the workers. And that last part is by Lenin, What Is to Be Done. How interesting how in just a few years, Kotsky is going to turn on all of this in order to defend the imperialist fucking war. Just interesting, you know, looking back, like in hindsight, and reading these words, and Kotsky being on the right side of history here, and when that imperialist war comes about, he turns into a little imperialist defender. To explain this in greater detail, in our times, only two ideologies can exist: bourgeois and socialist. The difference between them is, among other things, that the former, i.e., bourgeois ideology, is much older, more widespread, and more deep-rooted in life than the latter. That one encounters bourgeois views everywhere, in one's own and in other circles, whereas socialist ideology is only taking its first steps, is only just hewing a road for itself. Needless to say, as regards the spread of ideas, bourgeois ideology, i.e., trade unionist consciousness, spreads far more easily and embraces the spontaneous working class movement far more widely than socialist ideology, which is only taking its first steps. That is all the more true for the reason that, even as it is, the spontaneous movement, the movement without socialism, leads to its becoming subordinated to bourgeois ideology. Again, Lenin, What is to be Done, page 28. And subordination to bourgeois ideology means ousting socialist ideology. Because one is the negation of the other. We shall be asked, but surely the working class gravitates towards socialism? Yes, it gravitates towards socialism. If it did not, the activities of social democracy would be fruitless. But it is also true that this gravitation is counteracted and hindered by another gravitation towards bourgeois ideology. I have just said that our social life is impregnated with bourgeois ideas, and consequently, it is much easier to spread bourgeois ideology than socialist ideology. It must not be forgotten that, meanwhile, the bourgeois ideologists are not asleep. They, in their own way, disguise themselves as socialists and are tireless in their efforts to subordinate the working class to bourgeois ideology. Even under these circumstances, the social democrats too, like the economists, go wool gathering and dragging at the tail of the spontaneous movement. And the working class movement is spontaneous when social democracy behaves that way. Then it is self-evident that the spontaneous working class movement will proceed along that beaten path and submit to bourgeois ideology until, of course, long wanderings and sufferings compel it to break with bourgeois ideology and strive for the social revolution. It is this that is called gravitating towards bourgeois ideology. Here's what Lenin says, quote, "The working class spontaneously gravitates towards socialism, but the more widespread and continuously revived in the most diverse forms, bourgeois ideology nevertheless spontaneously imposes itself upon the working class still more." Lenin, What is to be Done, page 29. This is precisely why the spontaneous working class movement, while it is spontaneous, while it is not yet combined with socialist consciousness, becomes subordinated to bourgeois ideology and gravitates towards such subordination. Again, What is to be Done, page 28. If that were not the case, social democratic criticism, social democratic propaganda would be superfluous. And it would be unnecessary to combine the working class movement with socialism. It is the duty of social democracy to combat this gravitation towards bourgeois ideology and to stimulate the other gravitation towards socialism. Someday, of course, after long wanderings and sufferings, the spontaneous movement would come into its own and arrive at the gates of the social revolution without the aid of social democracy, because the working class spontaneously gravitates towards socialism. Lenin, What is to be Done, page 29. But what is to happen in the meantime? What shall we do in the meantime? Fold our arms across our chests, as the economists do? And leave the field to the Struves and Zubetrovs? Renounce social democracy and thereby help bourgeois trade unionist ideology to predominate? Forget Marxism and not combine socialism with the working class movement? No. Social democracy is the advanced detachment of the proletariat. Karl Marx, Manifesto, page 15. And another note here, see Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, Selected Works, Volume 1, Moscow, 1951, page 44. No, social democracy is the advanced detachment of the proletariat, and its duty is always to be at the head of the proletariat. Its duty is to divert the working class movement from this spontaneous trade unionist tendency, to come under the wing of the bourgeoisie, and to bring it under the wing of the revolutionary social democracy. And that's again Lenin, What is to be Done, page 28. The duty of social democracy is to imbue the spontaneous working class movement with socialist consciousness, to combine the working class movement with socialism and thereby lend the proletarian struggle a social democratic character. It is said that in some countries the working class itself worked out the socialist ideology, scientific socialism, and will itself work it out in other countries too. And that, therefore, it is unnecessary to introduce socialist consciousness into the working class movement from without. But this is a profound mistake. To be able to work out the theory of scientific socialism, one must stand at the head of science. One must be armed with scientific knowledge, and be able to deeply investigate the laws of historical development. But the working class, while it remains a working class, is unable to stand in the van of science, to advance it, and investigate scientifically the laws of history. It lacks both the time and the means for that. Scientific socialism can arise only on the basis of profound scientific knowledge, says Kautsky. The vehicle of science is not the proletariat, but the bourgeois intelligentsia, Kautsky's italics. It was in the minds of individual members of that stratum that modern socialism originated, and it was they who communicated it to more intellectually developed proletarians. Page 6, Lenin, What is to be Done, page 11, where these lines are quoted from Kautsky's well-known article, Newsite, 1901, number 3, page 79. It was in the minds of individual members of that stratum that modern socialism originated, and it was they who communicated it to the more intellectually developed proletarians. Accordingly, Lenin says, all those who worship the spontaneous working class movement and look on with folded arms, those who continuously belittle the importance of social democracy and leave the field to the Struves and Zubetovs, all imagine that this movement itself works out scientific socialism. But that is a profound mistake. Lenin, What is to be Done? Some people believe that the St. Petersburg workers who went on strike in the 90s possessed social democratic consciousness, but that too is a mistake. There was no such consciousness among them, and there could not be. It, social democratic consciousness, could be brought to them only from without. The history of all the countries shows that the working class, exclusively by its own efforts, is able to develop only trade unionist consciousness, i.e., the conviction that it is necessary to combine in unions, fight the employers, and strive to compel the government to pass necessary labor legislation, etc. The theory of socialism, however, grew out of the philosophic, historical, and economic theories that were elaborated by the educated representatives of the propertied classes, the intellectuals. According to their social status, the founders of modern scientific socialism, Marx and Engels themselves, belong to the bourgeois intelligentsia. Lenin, What is to be Done, pages 20 and 21. That does not mean, of course, continues Lenin, that the workers have no part in creating such an ideology, but they take part not as workers, but as socialist theoreticians, at Proudhons and Weidlings. Both were working men. In other words, they take part only when, and to the extent that they are able, more or less to acquire the knowledge of their age and advance that knowledge. And again, Lenin, What is to be Done, page 27. We can picture all this to ourselves approximately as follows. There is a capitalist system. There are workers and masters. Between them, a struggle is raging. So far, there are no signs whatever of scientific socialism. Scientific socialism was not even thought of anywhere when the workers were already waging their struggle. Yes, the workers are fighting, but they are fighting separately against their masters. They come into collision with their local authorities. Here they go out on strike. There they hold meetings and demonstrations. Here they demand rights from the government. There they proclaim a boycott. Some talk about the political struggle, others about the economic struggle, and so forth. But that does not mean that the workers possess social democratic consciousness. It does not mean that the aim of their movement is to overthrow the capitalist system. That they are as sure of the overthrow of capitalism and of the establishment of the socialist system as they are of the inevitable rising of the sun. That they regard their conquest of political power, the dictatorship of the proletariat, as an essential means for achieving the victory of socialism, etc. In this work that we're reading here, because it precedes the inter-imperialist war where social democracy proves itself to be inescapable from being pro-imperialism, in this instance, social democracy, you can think of, whenever I say social democratic consciousness or social democracy, in your mind, substitute the word communist. Meanwhile, science develops. The working class movement gradually attracts its attention. Most scientists arrive at the opinion that the working class movement is a revolt of troublemakers, whom it would be a good thing to bring to their senses with the aid of the whip. Others believe that it is the duty of the rich to throw some crumbs to the poor, i.e., that the working class movement is a movement of paupers whose object is to obtain alms. And out of 1,000 scientists, perhaps only one may prove to be a man who approaches the working class movement scientifically investigates the whole of social life, watches the conflict of classes, listens closely to the murmuring of the working class, and, finally, proves scientifically that capitalist system is by no means eternal, that it is just as transient as feudalism was, and that it must inevitably be superseded by its negation, the socialist system, which can be established only by the proletariat by means of a social revolution. In short, scientific socialism is elaborated. It goes without saying that if there were no capitalism and the class struggle, there would be no scientific socialism. But it is also true that these few, for example Marx and Engels, would not have worked out scientific socialism had they not possessed scientific knowledge. What is scientific socialism without the working class movement? A compass which, if left unused, will only grow rusty, and then will have to be thrown overboard. What is a working class movement without socialism? A ship without a compass, which will reach the other shore in any case, but would reach it much sooner and with less danger if it had a compass. Combine the two, and you will get a splendid vessel, which will speed straight towards the other shore and reach its haven unharmed. Combine the working class movement with socialism, and you will get a social democratic movement which will speed straight towards the promised land. And so, it is the duty of social democracy, and not only social democratic intellectuals, to combine socialism with the working class movement, to imbue the movement with socialist consciousness, and thereby lend the spontaneous working class movement a social democratic character. That is what Lenin says. Some people assert that, in the opinion of Lenin and the majority, the working class movement will perish, will fail to achieve the social revolution if not combined with socialist ideology. That is an invention. The invention of idle minds, which could have entered the heads only of pseudo-Marxists like Anne. See, What is a Party? Mogazar. Number 6. An original excerpt, Mogazar the Traveler, a magazine dealing with history, archaeology, geography, and ethnography, published in Tiflis from 1901 to November 1905. In January 1905, it became the weekly literary and political publication of the Georgian Social Democrats, edited by F. Makaradze. It published articles by Bolshevik authors and also articles by Mensheviks. Lenin says definitely that the working class spontaneously gravitates towards socialism. What is to be done, page 29. And if he does not dwell on this at great length, it is only because he thinks it unnecessary to prove what has already been proved. Moreover, Lenin did not set out to investigate the spontaneous movement. He merely wanted to show those engaged in practical party work what they ought to do consciously. Here's what Lenin says in another passage, in his controversy with Martov. Quote, "Our party is the conscious exponent of an unconscious process." Exactly. And for this very reason, it is wrong to want every striker to have the right to call himself a party member. For if every strike were not only a spontaneous expression of a powerful class instinct of the class struggle, which is inevitably leading to the social revolution, but a conscious expression of that process, then our party would at once put an end to the entire bourgeois society. Lenin, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, page 53. As you see, in Lenin's opinion, even the class struggle and the class conflicts, which cannot be called social democratic, nevertheless inevitably lead the working class to the social revolution. If you are interested to hear the opinions of other representatives of the majority, here's what one of them, Comrade Gorin, said at the Second Party Congress. Quote, "What would the situation be if the proletariat were left to itself? It would be similar to what it was on the eve of the bourgeois revolution. The bourgeois revolutionaries had no scientific ideology. The bourgeois system came into being nevertheless. Even without ideologists, the proletariat would, of course, in the long run, work towards the social revolution, but it would do so instinctively. Instinctively, the proletariat would practice socialism, but it would lack socialist theory. Only the process would be slow and more painful." Minutes of the Second Party Congress, page 129. Further explanation is superfluous. Thus, the spontaneous working class movement, the working class movement without socialism, inevitably becomes petty and assumes a trade unionist character. It submits to bourgeois ideology. Shall I say that again? Thus, the spontaneous working class movement, the working class movement without socialism, inevitably becomes petty and assumes a trade unionist character. It submits to bourgeois ideology. Can we draw the conclusion from this that socialism is everything and the working class movement nothing? Of course not. Only idealists say that. Someday, in the far distant future, economic development will inevitably bring the working class to the social revolution, and, consequently, compel it to break off all connection with bourgeois ideology. The only point is that this path is a very long and painful one. On the other hand, socialism, without the working class movement, no matter on what scientific basis it may have arisen, nevertheless remains an empty phrase and loses its significance. Can we draw the conclusion from this that the movement is everything and socialism nothing? Of course not! Only pseudo-Marxists who attach no importance to consciousness because it is engendered by social life itself argue that way. Socialism can be combined with the working class movement and thereby be transformed from an empty phrase into a sharp weapon. The conclusion? The conclusion is that the working class movement must be combined with socialism. Practical activities and theoretical thought must merge into one and thereby lend the spontaneous working class movement a social democratic character. For social democracy is a combination of the working class movement with socialism. Efferet program published by the Central Committee, page 94. Karl Kautsky. Yeah, it's before all that. Right. For social democracy is a combination of the working class movement with socialism. Then socialism, combined with the working class movement, will, in the hands of the workers, be transformed from an empty phrase into a tremendous force. Then the spontaneous movement, transformed into a social democratic movement, will march rapidly along the true road to the socialist system. What then is the mission of Russian social democracy? What must we do? Our duty, the duty of social democracy, is to deflect the spontaneous working class movement from the path of narrow trade unionism to the social democratic path. Our duty is to introduce socialist consciousness, which Marx and Engels elaborated, into this movement and unite the advanced forces of the working class into one centralized party. Our task is always to be at the head of the movement and combat tirelessly all those, whether they be foes or friends, who hinder the accomplishment of this task. Such, in general, is the position of the majority. Our minority dislikes the position taken by the majority. It is un-Marxist, it says. It fundamentally contradicts Marxism. But is that so, most highly esteemed gentlemen? Where? When? On what planet? Read our articles, they say, and you will be convinced we are right. Very well, let us read them. We have before us an article entitled, "What is a Party?" See Marxari number 6. Of what does the critic accuse the party majority? Quote, it, the majority, proclaims itself the head of the party and demands submission from others. And to justify its conduct, it often invents new theories, such as, for example, that the working people cannot by their own efforts assimilate lofty ideals. My italics, etc. Lenin, Marxari number 6. The question now is, does the majority advance, or has it ever advanced such theories? Never. Nowhere. On the contrary, Comrade Lenin, the ideological representative of the majority, very definitively says that the working class very easily assimilates lofty ideals. That it very easily assimilates socialism. Listen, quote, it is often said, the working class spontaneously gravitates towards socialism. This is perfectly true, in the sense that socialist theory defines the causes of the misery of the working class more profoundly and more correctly than any other theory. And for that reason, the workers are able to assimilate to it so easily. Lenin, What is to be Done, page 29. As you see, in the opinion of the majority, the workers easily assimilate to lofty ideas, which are called socialism. So what is Anne getting at? What did he dig up? What did he dig up his find? The point is, reader, that critic Anne had something entirely different in mind. He had in mind that passage in What is to be Done, where Lenin speaks of the elaboration of the theory of socialism, where he says that the working class cannot elaborate scientific socialism by its own efforts. 28. Lenin, What is to be Done, pages 20 to 21. But how is that, you will ask? To elaborate the theory of socialism is one thing. To assimilate it is another. Why did Anne forget those words of Lenin's in which he so clearly speaks of the assimilation of lofty ideas? You are right, reader. But what can Anne do since he is so anxious to be a critic? Just think what a heroic deed he is performing. He invents a theory of his own, ascribes it to his opponent, and then bombards the fruit of his own imagination. That is criticism, if you like. At all events, it is beyond doubt that Anne could not, by his own efforts, assimilate Lenin's book, What is to be Done. I'm sorry that offends you, First Kick viewer. Let us now open the so-called Social Democrat, the newspaper we talked about earlier. What does author of article Majority or Minority, see Social Democrat number 1, say? Plucking up courage, he vociferously attacks Lenin for expressing the opinion that the, quote, natural, it ought to be spontaneous development of the working class movement leads not to socialism, but to bourgeois ideology. Social Democrat number 1, page 14. The author evidently fails to understand that the spontaneous working class movement is a movement without socialism. Let the author prove that this is not so, and that such a movement inevitably submits to bourgeois trade unionist ideology, gravitates towards it. For in our times there can be only two ideologies, socialist and bourgeois, and where the former is absent, the latter inevitably appears and occupies its place. Prove the opposite. Yes, this is exactly what Lenin says. But at the same time, he does not forget about another gravitation that is characteristic of the working class movement. Gravitation towards socialism, which is only temporarily eclipsed by the gravitation towards bourgeois ideology. Lenin says definitively that the working class spontaneously gravitates towards socialism. Lenin, What is to be Done, page 29. And he rightly observes that it is the duty of social democracy to accelerate the victory of this gravitation by, among other things, combating the economists. What we know today as the Social Democrats, basically. The whole of the Social Democrats today, and after the split following World War I. Why then, esteemed critic, did you not quote these words of Lenin in your article? Were they not uttered by the very same Lenin? Because it was not in your advantage? Isn't that so? In Lenin's opinion, the worker, owing to his position, my italics, is a bourgeois rather than a socialist. Social Democrat, number 1, page 14. Continues the author. Well, I didn't expect anything so stupid, even from such an author. Excuse the ableism. Does Lenin talk about workers' position? Does he say that owing to his position, the worker is a bourgeois? Who but an idiot can say that owing to his position, the worker is a bourgeois? The worker who owns no means of production and lives by selling his labor power. No. Lenin says something entirely different. The point is that owing to my position, I can be a proletarian and not a bourgeois. But at the same time, I can be unconscious of my position and, as a consequence, submit to bourgeois ideology. This is exactly how the matter stands in this case with the working class. And it means something entirely different. My God, like how many times am I saying this shit? Literally that right there. About class traders. In general, the author is fond of hurling empty phrases about he shoots them off without thinking. Thus, for example, the author ostensibly reiterates that Leninism fundamentally contradicts Marxism. Social Democrat, page 15. He reiterates this and fails to see where this idea leads him. Let us believe for a moment his statement that Leninism does fundamentally contradict Marxism. But what follows? What comes of this? The following. Leninism carried with it Iskra, the old Iskra. This, the author does not deny. Consequently, Iskra too fundamentally contradicts Marxism. The Second Party Congress, the majority numbering 35 votes, recognized Iskra as the central organ of the party and highly praised its services. Again, see minutes of the Second Party Congress, page 141. Resolution where Iskra is described as the true advocate of the principles of the Social Democrats. Consequently, that Congress, its program, and its tactics also fundamentally contradict Marxism. Funny, isn't it, reader? Don't laugh. The author nevertheless continues. Quote, in Lenin's opinion, the spontaneous working class movement is moving towards combination with the bourgeoisie. Unquote. Yes, indeed, the author is undoubtedly moving towards combination with idiocy, and it would be a good thing if he digressed from that path. But let us leave the critic. Let us turn to Marxism. Our esteemed critic ostensibly reiterates that the stand taken by the majority and by its representative Lenin fundamentally contradicts Marxism because he says Kautsky, Marx, and Engels say the opposite of what Lenin advocates. Is that the case? Let us see. Karl Kautsky, the author informs us, writes in his Ifrit program, the interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie are so antagonistic that the strivings of these two classes cannot be combined for any more or less prolonged period. In every country where the capitalist mode of production prevails, the participation of the working class in politics sooner or later leads to the working class separating from the bourgeois parties and forming an independent workers' party. Unquote. But what follows from this? Only that the interests of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are antagonistic. That sooner or later, the proletariat separates from the bourgeoisie to form an independent workers' party. Remember, a workers' party, but not a social democratic workers' party. The author assumes that here, Kautsky disagrees with Lenin. But Lenin says that sooner or later, the proletariat will not only separate from the bourgeoisie, but will bring about the social revolution, i.e., will overthrow the bourgeoisie. Come on, get it through your head here. See Lenin, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, page 53. Gosh. The task of social democracy, he adds, is to try to make this come about as quickly as possible. And to come about consciously. Yes, consciously, not spontaneously, for it is about this consciousness that Lenin writes. Quote, where things have reached the stage of the formation of the Independent Workers' Party, continues the critic, citing Kautsky's book, the party must sooner or later, of natural necessity, assimilate socialist tendencies, if it was not inspired by them from the very outset. It must, in the long run, become a socialist workers' party, i.e., social democracy. Social Democrat number 1, page 15. What does that mean? Only that the Workers' Party will assimilate socialist trends. But does Lenin deny this? Not in the least. Lenin plainly says that not only will the Workers' Party, but the entire working class assimilate socialism. Lenin, what is to be done? What then is the nonsense we hear from Social Democrat and its prevaricating hero? What is the use of all this balderdash? As the saying goes, he heard the sound of a bell, but where it came from he could not tell. That's exactly what happened to our muddle-headed author. Jesus Christ. It's getting funnier. As you see, Kautsky does not differ one iota from Lenin on that point. But all this reveals the author's thoughtlessness with exceptional clarity. Does Kautsky say anything in support of the stand taken by the majority? Here is what he writes in one of his splendid articles, in which he analyzes the draft program of the Austrian social democracy. Quote, many of our revisionist critics, the followers of Bernstein, believe that Marx asserted that economic development and the class struggle create not only the conditions for socialist production, but also and directly engender the consciousness, Karl Kautsky's italics, of its necessity. And these critics at once object that Britain, the country most highly developed capitalistically, is more remote than any other from the consciousness. Judging from the Austrian draft, one might assume that this view was shared by the committee that drafted the Austrian program. In the draft program, it is stated, quote, the more the capitalist development increases, the numbers of the proletariat, the more the proletariat is compelled and becomes fit to fight against capitalism. The proletariat becomes conscious of the possibility of and of the necessity for socialism. In this connection, socialist consciousness appears to be a necessary and direct result of the proletarian class struggle. But that is absolutely untrue. Modern socialist consciousness can only arise on the basis of profound scientific knowledge. The vehicle of science is not the proletariat, but the bourgeois intelligentsia, Karl Kautsky's italics. It was in the minds of individual members of that stratum that modern socialism originated. It was they who communicated it, scientific socialism, to the more intellectually developed proletarians who, in their turn, introduced it into the proletarian class struggle. Thus, socialist consciousness is something introduced to the proletarian class struggle from without, and not something that arose within it spontaneously. Accordingly, the old Hanfield program was adopted at the inaugural Congress of the Austrian Social Democratic Party in Hanfield in 1888. In its statement of principles, the program contained a number of points that correctly explained the course of social development and the tasks of the proletariat and the Proletarian Party. Later, at the Vienna Congress held in 1901, the Hanfield program was dropped, and another, based on revisionist views, was adopted in its place. So accordingly, the old Hanfield program quite rightly stated that the task of social democracy is to imbue the proletariat with the consciousness of its position and the consciousness of its tasks. New Zeit, 1901. Lenin quotes this passage from Kautsky's splendid article in What is to be Done, page 11 as well. Do you not recall, reader, analogous thoughts expressed by Lenin on the question? Do you not recall the well-known stand taken by the majority? Why did the Tiflis Committee and the Social Democrat magazine conceal the truth? Why, in speaking of Kautsky, did our esteemed critic fail to quote these words of Kautsky in his article? Whom are these most highly esteemed gentlemen trying to deceive? Why are they so contemptuous towards their readers? Is it not because they fear the truth, hide from the truth, and think that the truth also can be hidden? They behave like the bird which hides its head in the sand and imagines that nobody can see it. But they delude themselves as that bird does. If socialist consciousness has been worked out on a scientific basis, and if this consciousness is introduced into the working class movement from without by the efforts of social democracy, and not only by social democratic intellectuals, it is clear that all this happens because the working class, so long as it remains a working class, cannot lead science and work out scientific socialism by its own efforts. It lacks both time and the means for this. Here is what Karl Kautsky says in his Erfurt program. Quote, the proletarian can at best assimilate parts of the knowledge worked out by the bourgeois learning and adapt it to his objects and needs. But so long as he remains a proletarian, he lacks the leisure and the means to independently carry science beyond the limits reached by the bourgeois thinkers. Hence, spontaneous workers' socialism must bear all the essential marks of utopianism. The Erfurt program, published by the Central Committee, page 93. Utopianism is a false, unscientific theory, in brackets. Utopian socialism of this kind often assumes an anarchistic character, continues Kautsky. But, as is well known, wherever the anarchist movement, meaning by that proletarian utopianism, Karl Kautsky, really permeated the masses and became a class movement, it always sooner or later, despite its seeming radicalism, ended by being transformed into a purely trade unionist movement of the narrowest kind. Sound familiar? Again, Erfurt program. In other words, if the working class movement is not combined with scientific socialism, it inevitably becomes petty, assumes that narrow trade unionist character, and, consequently, submits to trade unionist ideology. But that means belittling the workers and extolling the intelligentsia, howled our critic and his social democrat. Poor critic. Miserable social democrat. They take the proletariat for a capricious young lady who must not be told the truth, who must not always be paid compliments so that she will not run away. No, most highly esteemed gentlemen, we believe that the proletariat will display more staunchness than you think. We believe that it will not fear the truth. As for you, what can one say to you? Even now you have shown that you fear the truth, and in your article, did you not tell readers what Kautsky's real views are? Thus, scientific socialism without the working class movement is an empty phrase that can always be easily thrown to the winds. On the other hand, the working class movement without socialism is aimless trade unionist wandering, which sometime or another, of course, lead the social revolution, but at the cost of long pain and suffering. The conclusion? The working class movement must combine with socialism. Social democracy is a combination of the working class movement with socialism. The Erfurt program, page 94. That is what Kautsky, the Marxist theoretician, says. We have seen that Iskra, the old Iskra, and the majority say the same. we have seen that Comrade Lenin takes the same stand. Thus, the majority takes a firm Marxist stand. Clearly, contempt for the workers, extolling the intelligentsia, the un-Marxist stand of the majority, and similar gems, which the Mensheviks' critics scatter so profusely, are nothing more than catchwords, figments of the imagination of the Tiflis Mensheviks. Jesus Christ. On the other hand, we shall see that actually it is the Tiflis minority, the Tiflis Committee, and the Social Democrat that fundamentally contradicts Marxism. But of this anon, meanwhile, we draw attention to the following. In support of his utterances, the author of the article Majority or Minority quotes the words of Marx. The theoretician of any class comes theoretically to the conclusion to which the class itself has already arrived practically. Social Democrat number 1. One of two things. Either the author does not know the Georgian language, or else there is a printer's error. No literate person would say to which it has already arrived. It would be correct to say at which it has already arrived, or to which it is already coming. If the author had in mind the latter, to which it is already coming, then I must observe that he is misquoting Marx. Marx did not say anything of the kind. If the author had the first formula in mind, then the sentence he quoted should have run as follows. Quote, the theoretician of any given class arrives theoretically at the conclusion at which the class itself has already arrived practically. In other words, since Marx and Engels arrived theoretically at the conclusion that the collapse of capitalism and the building of socialism are inevitable, it implies that the proletariat has already rejected capitalism practically, has already crushed capitalism, and has built up the socialist way of life in its place. Poor Marx! Who knows how many more absurdities our pseudo-Marxists will ascribe to him? But did Marx really say that? Here is what he actually said. The theoreticians who represent the petty bourgeoisie are driven, theoretically, to the same problems and solutions to which material interest and social position drive the latter practically. That is, in general, the relationship between the political and literary representatives of a class and the class they represent. If the 18th Brumaire is not available, see Minutes of the Second Party Congress, page 111, where these words of Marx are quoted. As you see, Marx does not say already arrived to. These philosophical words were invented by our esteemed critic. Consequently, Marx's own words possess an entirely different meaning. What idea does Marx propound in the above quoted proposition? Only that the theoretician of a given class cannot create an ideal, the elements of which do not exist in life. That he can only indicate the elements of the future, and on that basis theoretically create an ideal, which the given class reaches practically. The difference is that the theoretician runs ahead of the class and indicates the embryo of the future before the class does. That is what is meant by arriving at something theoretically. Here is what Marx and Engels say in their manifesto. Quote, the communists, i.e. social democrats, therefore, are on the one hand practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country. That section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. Unquote. Yes, the ideologists push forward. They see much further than the great mass of the proletariat. And this is the whole point. The ideologists push forward. And it is precisely for this reason that the idea socialist consciousness is of great importance for the movement. Is that why you attack the majority, esteemed critic? If it is, then say goodbye to Marxism and know that the majority is proud of its Marxist stand. The situation of the majority in this case, in many ways, recalls that of Engels in the 90s. The idea is the source of social life, asserted the idealists. In their opinion, social consciousness is the foundation upon which the life of society is built. That is why they were called idealists. It had to be proved that ideas do not drop from the skies, but are engendered by life itself. Marx and Engels entered the historical arena and magnificently accomplished this task. They proved that social life is the source of ideas, and therefore that the life of society is the foundation on which social consciousness is built. Thereby, they dug the grave of idealism and cleared the road for materialism. Certain semi-Marxists interpreted this meaning as meaning that consciousness, ideas, are of very little importance in life. I'm going to say that again because that's a fucking common thing and why I keep telling people they should study Juche right there. Certain emphasis on the certain semi-Marxists interpreted this as meaning that consciousness, ideas, are of very little importance in life. The great importance of ideas had to be proved. And so Engels came forward and, in his letters, 1891-94, emphasized that while it is true that ideas do not drop from the skies, but are engendered by life itself, yet once born, ideas acquire great importance, for they unite men, organize them, and put their impress upon the social life which has engendered them. Ideas are of great importance in historical progress. Please take note of that, anti-Juche semi-Marxists. I'm using that from now on. Quote, "This is not Marxism, but a betrayal of Marxism," shouted Bernstein and his ilk. The Marxists only laughed. There were semi-Marxists in Russia. The economists. They asserted that since ideas are engendered by social life, socialist consciousness is of little importance for the working class movement. It had to be proved that socialist consciousness is of great importance for the working class movement. That without it, the movement would be aimless trade unionist wandering. And nobody could say when the proletariat would rid itself of it and reach the social revolution. And Iskra appeared and magnificently accomplished this task. The book What is to be Done appeared, in which Lenin emphasized the great importance of socialist consciousness. The party Majority was formed and firmly took this path. But here the little Bernsteins come out and begin to shout, "This fundamentally contradicts Marxism!" But do you, little economists, know what Marxism is? Surprising, the reader will say. What's the matter, he will ask. Why did Plekhanov write his article criticizing Lenin? See the new Iskra, numbers 10 and 11. What is he censoring the majority for? Are not the pseudo-Marxists of Tiflis and their social democrat repeating the ideas expressed by Plekhanov? Yes, they are repeating them, but in such a clumsy way that it becomes disgusting. Yes, Plekhanov did criticize, but do you know what the point is? Plekhanov does not disagree with the majority and with Lenin. And not only Plekhanov, neither Martov or Zuchelich nor Axelrod disagree with them. Actually, on the question we have been discussing, the leaders of the minority do not disagree with the old Iskra. And the old Iskra is the banner of the majority. Don't be surprised. Here are the facts. We are familiar with the old Iskra's programmatic article. See above. We know that the article fully expresses the stand taken by the majority. Whose article is it? The article of the editorial board of Iskra of that time. Who were the members of the editorial board? Lenin, Plekhanov, Axelrod, Martov, Zuchlich, and Starover. Of these, only Lenin now belongs to the majority. The other 5 leaders are of the minority. But the fact remains that they were the editors of Iskra's programmatic article. Consequently, they ought not to repudiate their own words. Presumably, they believed what they wrote. But we shall leave Iskra, if you like. Here is what Martov writes. Quote, thus, the idea of socialism first arose not among the masses of the workers, but in the studies of scholars from the ranks of the bourgeoisie. Martov, The Red Flag, page 3. And here is what Vera Zuchlich writes. Quote, even the idea of class solidarity of the entire proletariat is not so simple that it could arise independently in the mind of every worker. And socialism most certainly does not spring up in the minds of the workers automatically. The ground for the theory of socialism was prepared by the entire development of both life and knowledge, and created by the mind of a genius who was armed with that knowledge. Similarly, the dissemination of the ideas of socialism among the workers was initiated, almost over the entire continent of Europe, by socialists who had received their training in educational establishments for the upper classes. Zera, number 4. And that's true. Right? Look at where Marx went. Let us now hear of Plekhanov, who so pompously and solemnly criticized Lenin in his new Iskra, numbers 10 and 11. The scene is the Second Party Congress. Plekhanov is arguing against Martynov and defending Lenin. He censors Martynov, who had seized on a single sentence of Lenin's and had overlooked the book, What is to be Done, as a whole, and goes on to say, quote, Comrade Martynov's trick reminds me of a censor who said, quote, permit me to tear a sentence from the Lord's Prayer from its context, and I will prove to you that its author deserves to be hanged. But all the reproaches hurled at this unfortunate sentence, Lenin's, not only by Comrade Martynov, but also by many, many others, are based on a misunderstanding. Comrade Martynov quotes the words of Engels. Modern socialism is the theoretical expression of the modern working class movement. Comrade Lenin also agrees with Lenin, but Engels' words are a general proposition. The question is, who first formulates this theoretical expression? Lenin did not write a treatise on the philosophy of history, but a polemical article against the economists, who said, we must wait and see what the working class arrives at by its own efforts, without the aid of the revolutionary Balakists, without the social democracy, that is. The latter was prohibited from telling the workers anything, precisely because it is a revolutionary Balakist, i.e., because it possesses theoretical consciousness. But if you eliminate the Bacillus, all that remains is the unconscious mass, into which the consciousness must be introduced from the outside. Had you wanted to be fair to Lenin, and had you carefully read his whole book, you would have seen that that is precisely what he says. Minutes of the Second Party Congress, page 123. This is what Plekhanov said at the Second Party Congress. And now, several months later, the same Plekhanov, instigated by the same Martov, Axelrod, Zuchlich, and Starover, and others, speaks again, and seizing on the very same sentence of Lenin's that he defended at the Congress, says Lenin and the majority are not Marxists. He knows that even if a sentence from the Lord's Prayer is torn from its context and interpreted separately, the author of the prayer might find himself on the gallows for heresy. He knows that this would be unfair, that an unbiased critic would not do such a thing. Nevertheless, he tears this sentence from Lenin's book. Nevertheless, he acts unfairly and publicly besmirches himself. And Martov, Zuchlich, Axelrod, and Starover pander to him and publish his article under their editorship in the New Iskra, numbers 70 and 71, and thereby disgrace themselves once again. Why did they exhibit such spinelessness? Why did these leaders of the minority besmirch themselves? Why did they repudiate the programmatic article in Iskra, to which they themselves had subscribed? Why did they repudiate their own words? Has such falsity ever before been heard of in the Social Democratic Party? What happened during the few months that elapsed between the Second Congress and the appearance of Plekhanov's article? What happened was this. Of the 6 editors, the Second Congress elected only 3 to be editors of Iskra: Plekhanov, Lenin, and Martov. As for Axelrod, Starover, and Zuchlich, the Congress appointed them to other posts. It goes without saying that the Congress had a right to do this, and it was the duty of everyone to submit to it. The Congress expresses the will of the party. It is the supreme organ of the party, and whoever acts contrary to its decisions tramples upon the will of the party. But these obstinate editors did not submit to the will of the party, to party discipline. Party discipline is the same as the will of the party. It would appear that party discipline was invented only for simple party workers like us. They were angry with the Congress for not electing them as editors. They stepped to the side, took Martov with them, and formed an opposition. They proclaimed a boycott against the party, refused to carry on any party activities, and began to threaten the party. Elect us, they said, to the editorial board, to the central committee, and to the party council, otherwise we shall cause a split. And a split ensued. Thus, they trampled upon the will of the party once again. Here are the demands of the striker editors. Quote, the old editorial board of Iskra to be restored. Thus, give us 3 seats on the editorial board. A definite number of members of the opposition, i.e. of the minority, to be installed in the central committee. 2 seats in the party council to be allocated to members of the opposition, etc. We present these terms as the only ones that will enable the party to avoid a conflict which will threaten its very existence, i.e. satisfy our demands, otherwise we shall cause a big split in the party. What did the party say to them in reply? The party's representative, the central committee, and other comrades said to them, we cannot go against the decisions of the party Congress. Elections are a matter of the Congress. And nevertheless, we shall endeavor to restore peace and harmony, although, to tell the truth, it is disgraceful to fight for seats. You want to split the party for the sake of seats, etc. The striker editors took offense. They were embarrassed. Indeed, it did look as though they had started the fight for the sake of seats. They pulled Plekhanov over to their side and launch their heroic cause. Perhaps the reader will ask how it was possible for Plekhanov to go over to the minority, that same Plekhanov who had been an ardent supporter of the majority. The fact is that disagreements arose between him and Lenin. When the minority flew into a rage and proclaimed the boycott, Plekhanov took the stand that it was necessary to yield to them entirely. Lenin did not agree with him. Plekhanov gradually began to incline towards the minority. Disagreements between the two grew until they reached such a pitch that one fine day, Plekhanov became an opponent of Lenin and the majority. Here is what Lenin writes about this. Several days later, I, with member of the council, did indeed go to see Plekhanov, and our conversation with Plekhanov took the following course. You know, said Plekhanov, some wives, i.e., the minority, are such shrews that you have to yield to them to avoid hysterics and a big public scandal. Perhaps, I answered, but we must yield in such a way as to remain strong enough to prevent a still bigger scandal. See commentary on the minutes of the League, page 31, where Lenin's letter is quoted. Lenin and Plekhanov failed to reach agreement. From that moment, Plekhanov began moving over to the minority. We have learned from reliable sources that Plekhanov is now deserting the minority and has already founded his own organ, Dunavik Sociedad Demokrata. And that's the Social Democrat's Diary, a magazine published in Geneva at irregular intervals by G.V. Plekhanov from March 1905 to April 1912. 16 issues appeared. One more issue appeared in 1916. So that's about Plekhanov going over. So they pulled Plekhanov over to their side and launched their heroic cause. They were obliged to seek some stronger disagreement between the majority and the minority in order to show that they were not fighting for the sake of seats. They searched and searched until they found a passage in Lenin's book which, if torn from the context and interpreted separately, could indeed be cavilled at. A happy idea, thought the leaders of the minority. Lenin is the leader of the majority. Let us discredit Lenin and thereby swing the party to our side. And so Plekhanov began to trumpet to the world that Lenin and his followers are not Marxists. True, only yesterday they defended the very idea in Lenin's book, which they are attacking today, but that cannot be helped. An opportunist is called an opportunist precisely because he has no respect for principle. That is why they besmirch themselves. That is the cause of their falsity. But that is not all. Some time passed, they saw that nobody was paying attention to their agitation against the majority, and Lenin, apart from a few naive persons, they saw that their affairs were in a bad way and decided to change their colors again. On March 10th, 1905, my birthday, well, before my birthday, but March 10th, the same Plekhanov and the same Martov and Axelrod, in the name of the party council, passed a resolution in which, among other things, they said, quote, comrades, addressing themselves as the majority, both sides, i.e. the majority and the minority, have repeatedly expressed the conviction that the existing disagreements on tactics and organization are not of such a character as to render impossible activities within a single party organization. Iskra number 91, the new Iskra. Therefore, they said, let us convene a comrades' court, consisting of Babel and others, to settle our slight disagreement. In short, the disagreements in the party are merely a squabble, which a comrades' court will investigate. But we are united whole. But how can that be? We non-Marxists are invited into the party organizations? We are united whole, and so on and so forth? What does it mean? Why, you leaders of the minority are betraying the party. Can non-Marxists be put at the head of a party? Is there room for non-Marxists in the ranks of the Social Democratic Party? Or perhaps you too have betrayed the cause of Marxism and have, therefore, changed front. But it would be naive to expect a reply. The point is that these wonderful leaders have several principles in their pockets. And whenever they want a particular one, they take it out. As the saying goes, they have a different opinion for every day of the week. Such are the leaders of the so-called minority. It is easy to picture oneself what the tail of this leadership, the so-called Tiflis minority, is like. The trouble also is that at times the tail pays no heed to the head and refuses to obey. For example, while the leaders of the minority consider that conciliation is possible and call for harmony among party workers, the Tiflis minority and its social democrat continue to rave and shout. Between the majority and minority, there is a life and death struggle. Which is from Social Democrat number 1. We must exterminate each other. They are all at 6s and 7s. The minority complain that we call them opportunist, unprincipled. What else can we call them if they repudiate their own words? If they swing from side to side? If they are eternally wavering and hesitating? Can a genuine social democrat change his opinions every now and again? The minority changes theirs more often than one changes pocket handkerchiefs. Our pseudo-Marxists ostensibly reiterate that the minority is truly proletarian in character. Is that so? Let us see. Kautsky says that it is easier for the proletarian to become imbued with party principles. He inclines towards a principled policy that is independent of the mood of the moment and of personal or local interests. Ifrit program published it by the Central Committee, page 88. But what about the minority? Is it inclined towards a policy that is independent of the mood of the moment, etc.? On the contrary, it is always hesitating, eternally wavering. It detests a firm principled policy. It prefers unprincipledness. It follows the mood of the moment. We are already familiar with the facts. Kautsky says that the proletarian likes party discipline. Quote, the proletarian is non-entity so long as he remains an isolated individual. His strength, his progress, his hope, and expectations are entirely derived from organization. That is why he is not distracted by personal advantage or personal glory. He performs his duty in any post he is assigned to with voluntary discipline which pervades all his feelings and thoughts. See Lenin, One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, 93, where he quotes these words of Kautsky. But what about the minority? Is it too imbued with a sense of discipline? On the contrary, it despises party discipline and ridicules it. See Minutes of the League. The first to set an example in violating party discipline were the leaders of the minority. Recall Axelrod, Zolcherlich, Starover, Martov, and others who refused to submit to the decision of the Second Congress. Quite different is the case of the intellectual, continues Kautsky. He finds it extremely difficult to submit to party discipline, and does so by compulsion, not of his own free will. He recognizes the need of discipline only for the mass, not for the chosen few. And of course he counts himself among those few. An ideal example of an intellectual who had become thoroughly imbued with the sentiments of the proletariat, and who worked in any post he was assigned to, subordinated himself wholeheartedly to our great cause, and despised the spineless whining, which the intellectual is all too prone to indulge in when he happens to be in the minority. An ideal example of such an intellectual is Leibniz, we may also mention Marx, who never forced himself to the forefront, and whose party discipline in the International, where he often found himself in the minority, was exemplary. See Lenin, One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, where he quotes these lines of Kautsky again. But what about the minority? Does it display anything of the sentiments of the proletariat? Is its conduct anything like that of Leibniz and Marx? On the contrary, we have seen that the leaders of the minority have not subordinated their ego to our sacred cause. We have seen that these leaders, who indulged in spineless whining when they found themselves in the minority at the Second Congress, we have seen that it was they who, after the Congress, wailed for front seats and that it was they who started a party split for the sake of these seats. Is this your proletarian character, esteemed Mensheviks? Then why are the workers on our side in some towns? The Mensheviks ask us. Yes, it is true. In some towns, the workers are on the side of the minority. But that proves nothing. Workers even follow revisionists, the opportunists in Germany, in some towns. But what does that not prove that their stand is a proletarian one? It does not prove that they are not opportunists. One day, a crow found a rose, but that did not prove that the crow is a nightingale. It is not for nothing that the saying goes, when a crow picks up a rose, I'm a nightingale, it crows. It is now clear on what grounds these disagreements in the party arose. As is evident, two trends have appeared in our party: the trend of proletarian firmness and the trend of intellectual wavering. And this intellectual wavering is expressed by the present minority, the Tiflis Committee, and its Social Democrat, the magazine, are the obedient slaves of this minority. That is the whole point. True, our pseudo-Marxists often showed that they are opposed to the mentality of the intellectual, and that they accuse the majority of intellectual wavering. But this reminds us of the case of the thief who stole some money and began to shout, "Stop, thief!" Moreover, it is well known that the tongue ever turns to the aching tooth. Produced from the pamphlet published by the Caucasian Union Committee of the RSDLP, May 1905. Translated from Georgian, Comrade Stalin. There you go. That's all about the disagreements in the Transcaucasian Party at the time. Next week we'll be reading from the work Armed Insurrection and Our Tactics.